Okay, I just wanted to mention something before that I didn't say. I just wanted to take a look here. Just read this the function of proteins. Okay, we said that they are for defense, like the immunoglobulins. They can guide the chemical reactions of metabolic processes, so then they're enzymes. They can act as chemical messengers that travel in the blood, like hormones, like for example, insulin, even testosterone is another hormone. They can provide structural support. Okay, we'll find that proteins make up all kinds of structures in the cell. They give support to the cell. They can transport molecules like oxygen, for example, the hemoglobin we saw. Okay, and also there are proteins that have a contractile property, and that particular protein is called actin, and we find that in muscles, for example. And proteins also can provide energy. Anyway, the next molecule and then macromolecule that we want to talk about is the fatty acid, okay? So we have a molecule now called a fatty acid, and you can see that the structure is a carbon, which is double bound to oxygen. There's a R variable group on this side, and there's an OH on this side. Now, the R in a fatty acid is not the same as the R's that we saw in the amino acids, okay? These R's in the fatty acids are usually very long chains of carbons and hydrogens only, So it's a little different than the R's that we saw in the amino acids. So this is the third biological molecule that we want to look at. We looked at the glucose or the sugars, which make up the carbohydrates, the macromolecules. We looked at the amino acids, which are the molecules that make up the macromolecules called proteins. Now we're looking at fatty acids. Let's see what we can see with the fatty acids, okay? So here's a couple of fatty acids. Again, look at the general formula. You've got the C, the double bond O, just like we had a second ago, okay? We have an OH also, and then we have a R group. And as I said, these R groups in the fatty acids are very long chains of carbons and hydrogens. Okay, take a look at that. Here's another one, the same thing. The C, the double bond O, the OH, and then a long chain of carbons and hydrogens. Okay, so these are both examples of two fatty acids. Now, what's important, and we're going to return to this concept, is when we take three fatty acids, I'm just using names here, otherwise the picture gets too complex. In other words, when I take maybe this one and a third one, and I put them all together on a alcohol called glycerol, a glycerol backbone, I form something called a triglyceride, which I think you've all heard of, a TRG, a triglyceride, okay? So three fatty acids, okay, when they're combined to a alcohol called glycerol, they form a triglyceride, which is a macromolecule, okay? If you look at the lipid family, there's quite a few, okay? There's many different types, okay? There's triglycerides, okay? They all start out with the basic fatty acid, and then from there we build up to larger things, and we already saw that one of them is a triglyceride, okay? Here's our triglyceride. Here's another picture of the triglyceride. Here we're seeing in more detail. So take a look, C, double bond O, OH, and then the very long chain of carbons and hydrogens. Same thing over here. So that's another fatty acid. Here's a third fatty acid. And when I combine these three fatty acids onto this alcohol, glycerol, and I know this is an alcohol because it's got the OH groups that makes it into an alcohol. If I do a reaction and I hook these together here, like so, okay, I form what is called a triglyceride. So I go from my molecules to my very large macromolecule. Look how big this is, okay? It's got a backbone of the glycerol, and then it's got these very long extensions of fatty acids. But you can also see from this picture that there are, besides the triglycerides, and there's also something called phospholipids, even steroids are part of the lipid family. So you can see here that, you know, if you do some different structural adaptations, you get a steroid, for example, over here, but we will talk about that at some other time, okay? But we also want to look at something called a phospholipid because that's very important in the cell membrane. In other words, if I remove one of the fatty acids, as you see here, let's get rid of this fatty acid. I put 3 on, right, to make a triglyceride. But if I take 1 away and I put a phosphate group here, okay, this forms what's called a phospholipid. And don't worry about this. Phospholipids are important because they make up the cell membrane. Okay, lipids we know we find in oils and in waxes. And again, to look at the review, okay, we have a molecule called a fatty acid. Remember the general structure of a fatty acid, okay, C double bond O, OH, and the R group. And then we can take a look at the macromolecules. We form from fatty acids, triglycerides, remember, that's 3 fatty acids plus glycerol. Phospholipids replace one of those fatty acids. Okay, and if you replace one of those fatty acids and put a phosphate group, then you have the phospholipid. And the sex hormones are also types of lipids and steroids. So all of these are lipids, which are the macromolecules. Okay, so we went from molecules, okay, actually a little larger, water and methane, they were small molecules. But then we got to bigger molecules like the glucose or the amino acids or the fatty acids. And then we made much larger molecules called macromolecules, okay, macromolecules. Now, what happens next, okay? Well, these macromolecules, they actually, when they're put together and assembled, the macromolecules are going to make up little tiny organs that we find inside the cell, okay, and they're called organelles, okay? They're called organelles. So we're going to then take a look at the next level of organization, the organelles, okay? So we just kind of digressed a little bit because we wanted to explain particular biological molecules, but if you remember and recall, we had the beginning with the quarks, subatomic particles, the atoms, okay, and the atoms are the smallest part of an element. And then we had the atoms making up the molecules, okay? And I just want to mention that living things contain large percentages of atoms such as carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, okay? COHN, cone, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. We have a lot of that in us. We have a lower percentage of other types of elements in our bodies. Things like sulfur and phosphorus, magnesium, iodine, iron, calcium, sodium, chlorine, and potassium. But in any event, we have a lot of these things. But the most important in living things is C, O, H, and N. Okay, so now that we made up the macromolecules, which are the proteins, the carbohydrates, and the lipids, if we put those and arrange them, we can then come up with the little organs that we find inside the cell. And you probably have heard of the names of some of these, okay? So here's, for example, a mitochondria. The mitochondria is made up of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, okay? Here's another organelle called the Golgi apparatus, okay? It's also made up of macromolecules, okay? It's made up of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. And you see here we have a nucleus also made up of the macromolecules, and here's something called the rough endoplasmic reticulum, another one of the little organs that we find inside of a cell, okay? This mitochondria, by the way, carries out what's called cellular respiration. Now, if you take all the organelles, okay, we take all the organelles, and if I add to the organelles, okay, the cytoplasm that they kind of slosh around in, okay, and I put a membrane around that, okay, so I'm going to take these organelles, okay, they're floating around in a kind of a gelatinous substance, and I put a membrane around it, I form the next level of organization, which is called the cell. Okay, and the cell is the smallest unit that can survive all by itself, okay, and it is actually the first thing that we can call alive. And here is an example of a single-celled organism. In other words, this is a funny shaped cell. It's not entirely round, but this is a single-celled organism called an amoeba, and it can live all by itself, okay? It's, you see, got a nucleus, and it's got these little feet called pseudopods. It doesn't get up and walk around, but it extends these little extensions, and then the rest of the body will catch up, and then extends out another one, and the rest of the body will catch up. But the important thing here is that this is a single-celled organism, okay, called an amoeba, and it is alive. It's called a unicellular organism. It's something called a protist, okay, and it's part of the group that we classify as protists. Another example of a single-celled organism is a paramecium. Okay, it's another protist, and here you see the paramecium. It's a single cell. It contains various organelles inside of it. Okay, the organelles are floating around in a cytoplasm, and then there's a barrier around it. If there wasn't a barrier, we wouldn't have the organism. Everything would just spill out all over the place. But this is a unicellular organism called a paramecium, okay? And this paramecium can live all by itself. It's alive, just like this amoeba can live all by itself. It's alive, okay? So they can live, these organisms that are single cell can live freely and independently, and they are the first part of our organization of nature that we can actually call alive. Now, besides single cellular organisms, we have multicellular organisms. But before I get there, let's take a look at here is a nice picture of a generic cell. As you see, this is a nice picture. You can see here the mitochondria that we saw before, the nucleus, okay, the Golgi apparatus, and then you put in some cytoplasm and some other organelles, and then you put a barrier around it, and you have what we call a typical animal cell. Okay, they like to draw things round, but we'll see there's many different shapes for cells. Plant cells, okay, have more of a rectangular shape and a very thick cell wall. Animal cells don't have a cell wall. Animal cells have a cell membrane here, but plant cells, besides the cell membrane, they have a thick wall around them made up of cellulose, but they have other organelles, okay? So this is a plant cell, okay? And then we're gonna examine all different types of cells in the next module.